Okay guys, in this lesson we take a look at the global switches settings under the V-Ray tab. So let's open up our render settings and see what we have. As most of these options are extremely self-explanatory, I'm not going to explain each option using examples unless it's necessary. First of all, let's set the interface to expert so we can see all the parameters here. We have displacement, which globally enables or disables displacement mapping. If you have tons of your displacement modifiers in your scene or in your V-Ray materials and you want to turn off all of them at once, you can use this option. We have force backface culling, enables or disables backface culling for camera and shadow rays. When this option is enabled, the surfaces of objects which are turned away from the camera will appear fully transparent. We have lights which turn on or off the lights that are already enabled in the scene. Hidden lights, this option controls the hidden lights in the scene. If you have hidden bunch of lights in your scene but they are still enabled in the modify panel, this option decides whether those hidden but enabled lights will be included in the render or not. If hidden light option is enabled, those lights will be included in the render, and if disabled, they won't be. We have shadows, which enables and disables the calculation of shadows in the render. Default light controls the state of default lights in the scene. By default, it's set to off with GI when basically when global illumination is disabled and we don't have any other lights in the scene, there would be a default light to lit the scene. And if set to off, the default lights will be off always no matter what. And if set to on, default lights are always switched on when there are no lights in the scene. So if I turn off all the lights in the scene by disabling the lights option and set the default lights to on and render the scene, you can see even though all the lights are off, we get the default lights to lit the scene. Let me stop the render and turn on lights and set the default lights to off with GI. Show GI only. When enabled, only the global illumination or indirect lighting will be shown in the final render. If I open up the frame buffer in the first render, show GI only is turned off, which is the default state, and in the second render it is turned on and we only get indirect lighting, basically only global illumination. Let's disable show GI only. Next we have probabilistic lights, and if I quote V-Ray guide, this option enables optimized sampling for scenes with many lights. When this option is disabled, V-Ray goes through each scene light and evaluates it at each hit point. In scenes with many lights and lots of GI bounces, this leads to a lot of shadow rays being traced and rendering can become extremely slow. This option makes it possible to render images that would otherwise take a very long time, at the expense of possibly introducing more noise into the rendering. When this option is enabled, V-Ray randomly chooses the specified number of lights and evaluates only those. Lower values make the rendering faster, but potentially more noisy. Higher values cause more lights to be computed at each hit point, thus producing less noise but increasing render time. End of quote. In this scene, if I go to the perspective view, we have about 210 sphere lights. Now let's take a look at the few renders with and without probabilistic lighting. In the first render, probabilistic lights is off, and in the second one it is on. I used progressive image sampler and the render limit was 3 minutes for both of these two renders, and as you can see in the render with probabilistic lights on, we get a cleaner render. Next we have don't render final image, and we use this in the GI section, and when this is enabled, only the GI maps like irradiance map, light cache will be calculated and the final image won't be rendered. We have reflection refraction, and when disabled, neither reflection nor refraction will be calculated in the final render. Maps enables or disables the texture maps used in the scene. In the first render, maps option is on and we get our textures in the render, and in the next one, maps is off. Let's enable it for now. Filter map enables or disables texture map filtering. We have filter maps for GI, which enables or disables texture filtering during calculation of GI and glossy reflections and refractions. When disabled, texture maps are not filtered for GI and glossy reflection refractions in order to speed up the calculations, and if this option is enabled, textures will be filtered. And GI filter multiplier is a multiplier for texture filtering for global illumination calculation. Override depth, if disabled, the reflection or refraction depth will be controlled locally within each material, and if enabled, none of the reflection or refraction depth in the materials can be higher than the value specified here. We have glossy effects. When enabled, all glossy reflections in the scene are replaced with non-glossy ones. And you can use this, for test renderings if you want to speed up the rendering in those phases. As you can see in the frame buffer, in the first render, glossy effects is on, and in the second one, it is off. And there is no glossy or blurry reflections in this render. Max transparency levels is the depth to which transparent objects will be traced. Now imagine if you had a leafy tree in your scene and you need a close-up shot from that tree, and leaves have a translucent material normally. You might need to increase the max transparency levels to see all the leaves. We have transparency cutoff, which controls when tracing of transparent objects will be stopped. If the accumulated transparency of array is below this value, this threshold here, no further tracing will be performed. And we have override material that we have used and discussed throughout the course. Basically, you can enable override material, define a material in this slot, and now all the objects in your scene will be rendered with that material unless you limit what the override material will be applied to using this include exclude list. Let me disable it for now. Max ray intensity suppresses the contribution of very bright rays, which may typically cause excessive noise or fireflies in the rendered image. Fireflies are those very bright individual pixels here and there. I think max ray intensity is on by default. For the next renders, I deleted 2/3 of the sphere lights in the scene. In the first render, max ray intensity is on and set to 20. And in the second one, it is off. You can see when it is off, we get very bright pixels here and there, and when max ray intensity is on and set to 20, we get rid of some of those very bright pixels or fireflies, but not all of them. In the next render, max ray intensity was set to 10, and now we get fewer of those fireflies. And in the next render, it was set to 5, which basically clears out those fireflies, even though possibly 10 would have been enough if we rendered the scene for a longer time. And if I compare the render in which max ray intensity was off and the one with max ray intensity set to 5, in that one, you can clearly see the difference. For now, let's set the max ray intensity to 5. Secondary rays bias is a small positive offset that will be applied to all secondary rays. This can be used if you have overlapping faces in the scene to avoid the black splotches that may appear. And we have legacy, sun, sky, and camera. And when disabled, which is the default state, V-Ray will use the improved and more accurate models. And if turned on, V-Ray will switch to the old sun, sky, and camera for, you can use this for compatibility issues if you loading an older scene or something like that. And we have 3ds Max photometric scale. When enabled, it aligns the V-Ray light, V-Ray sun, V-Ray sky, and V-Ray physical camera to the photometric units used by 3ds Max and its photometric lights. Okay, so that's about global switches rollout, and I will see you in the next lesson.